Hi everyone, welcome to Ice Day, February 2021. So I decided the easiest thing to do would be to give a lecture and post it to YouTube. You know, COVID has already messed with my plans enough and messed with the format of this class. Yeah, I've got my big cup of coffee here. I'm going to stick with it, and it's going to be pretty one-sided, obviously, but you know, take notes as if you were in class, I suppose. Hopefully this is a one-off. I have the ominous feeling next week we're going to have to do the same though, because I just saw the weather forecast and it says we're going to get snow on Monday and then another dollop later next week. So I don't know. I have a bad feeling. Anyway, I'm giving this as well, rather than telling you go read your textbook, because, well, number one, it's hard for you guys to pick out, you know, what it is that you really need to know about a particular topic. But what I will say is I'm really going to go over three things. Firstly, origins. Secondly, mots. And thirdly, ringworks. What I will not be doing very much of, I will in a couple of cases very briefly, but I will not be looking so much at case studies. So it's very important that you go over your textbook again, particularly as we, you know, get closer to the final exam, as far away as that feels right now, and go back over them with an eye towards case studies. The difference between an exam that gets an A or a B and an exam that doesn't is examples and case studies. That when you give an example of some development, you have a case study to back it up, but we don't have time to cover that in class. The other downside of making this at home is that, you know, my cats obviously don't hear me talk about medieval history enough and come running to see what I'm up to, who I'm talking to. I mean, I would have thought at this point they could give a whole course on castles themselves, but evidently not. They want to learn more. At least you're not on my, I'm not recording this talking to you with my head the way I do with the, with my online survey classes, so you don't get cat butt shoved right up in your camera. Okay, so we're going to start off with the origins. And this is in your readings in most detail by Crichton, who talks about castles between the years 800 and 1200. He emphasizes, and I think it's important to do so as well, that we're talking about origins plural in castles. The traditional castle story view was that France was at the heart of the action, and that it's to do with the feudalism in the Carolingian Empire, and they get going because of feudalism, and then they spread from there because, you know, the military determinism and technological determinism. Certainly, France is certainly one of the places that's at the heart of the action, but that story is rather simplistic. Sorry, the cat's just stuck her paw fully in my coffee. Oh, God, gross. Now I've got hairs in it. I really don't want to stop this video because it's going to take me long enough to make anyway. Okay, I'm just going to pick the cat hairs out. See, it's so much easier for you guys. You don't stick your hands in my coffee. Not that I'm allowed to have coffee in the classroom anymore. I'm supposed to. Right, can you not do that again? You're very wet. So the year 1000 is kind of a you know, hooray for us, easy to remember, and also a big deal. That's really when we start to see castles starting to boom and multiply. Though their origins are earlier than this, their origins are in the 9th and 10th centuries. One of the problems is the ambiguity that medieval writers use. Medieval historians and people who are like actually recording, the chroniclers, people who are recording intentionally the events of the day, are not like what we do. They do not prize accuracy. It's not really a thing for them. So that means that when you're studying castles, pretty much everything gets called castle. And when you're studying anything to do with numbers, it's always, you know, biased in that if it's a battle, our guys had 10, their guys had 20 million. Yeah, and that can impact on our study on castles too. So the fact that they, you know, call things castles, oftentimes they're not that big a deal. that the origins fanned out from France as its centre is not being constantly being challenged. Here we have one of our few case studies today. Comes from Germany, Der Hüsterknüpp, which is northwest of Cologne in the German Rhineland, which was a heavily, densely populated area in the Middle Ages. Very wealthy too, lots of trade focus on the River Rhine. So it's a major river system and a valley. Because it's on like water, this means that the site was waterlogged, and this creates what we call anaerobic conditions. Anaerobic conditions is that the soil is starved of oxygen, which slows down the decay process. And that means that organic materials survive in anaerobic conditions where they wouldn't in normal soil. So this, in the case of Der Hüsterknüpp, we're dealing with earth and timber castles today. That means we actually have unusually good timber preservation. Now, it's not perfect, it's waterlogged. You need to have specialist preservationists come out and treat your timber that you excavate at that point. But it's great for if we're looking for the origins of earth and timber castles. As an aside, I titled this Earthwork Castles, Mottes and Ringworks, but really we're better off calling them earth and timber castles, because the earthwork part is the foundations. What we're looking at is the part that medieval people wouldn't see, and so making descriptions and identifications based on a bit that a medieval person might not even know was there, it's a bit stupid, really. So we need to really, look for timber and imagine timber and try and reconstruct as well as we can. So this picture shows the development of Der Hüsterknüpp based on the excavation. And at the bottom there, that is a motte and bailey. So it was eventually around the year 1000 a motte and bailey. But as you can see, it was preceded by two earlier phases, starting in the 9th century, and developed in that there's separation between two areas, and there's a raising of the central area, and eventually it developed into a motte and bailey. So this supports the idea that mottes, and by extension ringworks as well, as we'll get to by the end of this video, they were evolving across Northern Europe, not just France, and that there's probably a lot of things going on. There's no one common start point. There's probably a lot of people thought that it was a good idea to raise a site and be able to have it at a height. As I was telling the Tuesday class, archaeologists and historians are obsessed with origins, which is something I don't necessarily get myself, but this is one of them. Where did they come from? And I think that sometimes they pursue this and ignoring the fact that building a square tower is not very exciting, or raising the most important part of your complex is a pretty logical response to many things. Being able to look better, being harder to get to, defend. There's lots of reasons why, and we tend to simplify it into one person had a great idea, when in reality, why couldn't this evolve lots of different directions? So another thing to remember that Der Hüsterknüpp shows us is that we can't just say earth and timber castles are early, and earth and timber castles are because you didn't have anything as good as a stone castle, or the wherewithal or the resources to build a stone castle. That is sheer determinism. We're imposing our modern views on the past. In the Middle Ages, deforestation was a real problem. And getting good quality building timber was a real investment, and sometimes could be, involved like serious imports from different countries even. So medieval people would have been very impressed by a building that used a lot of good quality timber in its construction, just as we are with, look at the stone. So by just looking at stone and going, oh, this is impressive, and the timber ones were rubbish, we're forgetting the medieval worldview, and we do need to keep that in mind. Also, we are talking about origins and construction. It's much harder to determine occupation. We really have to excavate for that. And then that can be a problem because, for example, medieval Ireland was pretty aceramic in that that means that they didn't use much pottery, and pottery is kind of the bread and butter of how archaeologists can date occupation levels at sites. So and I've completely lost my train of thought because I've not drunk enough coffee now that the cat has stuck her paw in it. So yeah, occupation. We need to remember that we're talking a lot of the time in this class about when things were constructed and not necessarily when things were occupied. We're talking about when moats and ringworks were constructed, and we need to remember that their occupation periods were much longer. Sometimes for several years. So they would have been occupied definitely at the same time as other stone castles would have been. And why they were phased out or abandoned might be related to stone castles or might be completely unrelated. So we need to keep our own modern bias in perspective there. Anyway, der Husterknap shows us that mock castles did not just make a sudden appearance. They were a much more evolutionary process. Now, the next group we're going to talk about are the Normans. The Normans were based in Normandy in northwest France, and as a result, we're pretty familiar with castle construction in Normandy because it was part of France, and France had pretty early castles. That was one of the origin points. Don't go so far. Some students hear me telling them that the Normans are very important in the development of castles and in the spread of feudalism, and hear it as the Normans were the ones who brought castles and feudalism everywhere they went. And it's thanks to the Normans that they had feudalism. And no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that they accelerate. They're an accelerant in the process. Particularly when we look at the British Isles and castle construction there. These pictures come from the Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts the events surrounding the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Historically, castle scholars said that the origins of castles in the British Isles came from the Normans, that the Normans pitched up, conquered 1066, and then had military superiority over the Anglo-Saxons, which is not the best term, but I can't think of anything better this week, and that goes for Tuesday as well. So the Anglo-Saxons who were there before. And they say, well, the castles weren't there before the Normans pitched up. True castles did not exist, the Normans brought them. But again, that is very simplistic when we're talking about origins. It also presumes that you can't have castles without feudalism, which is not true. We will have plenty of opportunity to critique feudalism as whether it existed, but certainly whether it existed or not, we often find a correlation, but correlation is not causation, as we all know. So you should have picked up already from your textbook reading that this association that the Normans brought castles to the British Isles has been challenged quite a lot recently, particularly Crichton talks about it. But the background to this is because the Normans came from Normandy, where they were actually descendants of Vikings, and they built a lot of earthwork castles in Normandy prior to 1066 and then brought it with them when they came to England. So the events surrounding this were that, as depicted kind of here, we've got in the bottom left, this is the Anglo-Saxon King Harold being crowned king by Archbishop Stigand. And then on the next panel to the right, I've jumped forward in time and there's Harold being killed in battle. It's too blurry in this image because it's very fine, but why he's holding his fist in front of his face is because he's trying to pull no, wrong way around, an arrow out of his eye. An arrow out of his eye is what he is trying to do there. Another source, this is a primary source. It was completed soon after the Battle of Hastings. It was, engineered, not made by, but engineered certainly and overseen by somebody who participated in the battle, an eyewitness. That was Bishop Odo of Bayeux, who was the half-brother of Duke William of Normandy, who became William I of England. So he actually participated in the battle. He actually makes sure he's drawn into a lot of the scenes. So it's a very unusual primary source. Yeah, presumably they wanted people to know the story, and while literacy was definitely on the increase in this time, most people still would have been illiterate, particularly if they weren't in the church. So this way, this kind of operated like a comic book. It's got little captions, but you were supposed to like be able to look at the panels and tell the story from each individual panel. And the Normans provide us with another unique primary source, and that's the Domesday Book. And the Domesday Book is very useful for us castle people because it was completed 20 years after the conquest, 1086, and it's a tax record. It's a very detailed tax record. The nickname Domesday is actually because people at the time joked that it was so intrusive, it was like the Day of Judgment. They wanted to know exactly how many chickens you had, bushels of grain, everything, because they wanted to know how much they could tax you. It's awesome for us castle people, though, or anybody interested in the built environment or material culture, because we can see what has been done in that 20-year period. And the short answer is, there has been a building boom. There's been a lot of castles constructed, but there's also been a lot of town development, churches built, cathedrals built, just a lot of building going on. The Normans also conquered other places, not just England, which is why students forget that they're accelerants, not causes of feudalism and castles. They conquer a big chunk of Ireland after 1169. They're also, by this time, by 1066, well settled in the south of Italy and Sicily, and then they participate in the Crusades as well and settle the Holy Lands. So the big issue, therefore, has been, did the Normans bring castles with them, or were castles known in England prior to the Norman conquest? Now, the Royal Archaeological Institute set out in the 1970s to excavate some suspected pre-Norman castles. The evidence was pretty inconclusive from this project, but over time we have worked out that we're pretty blooming confident that there were castles in England before the Anglo-Normans. Just maybe not that many, they accelerated it, but they were already there. The reason why they theorized that they would excavate castles, including the two pictured here, was because the Anglo-Saxon king who died in 1066, kicking off the crisis, was a guy called Edward the Confessor. And Edward the Confessor died without an heir, and so the issue was who's going to be his heir. And that's what led to the Battle of Hastings. But Edward the Confessor had been in exile for a big chunk of his youth because Scandinavians had conquered England and made themselves kings of England. And so Edward had gone into exile, and he'd just hopped across the water and gone to Normandy. And so he'd actually married a Norman woman. He'd spent a long time at the Norman court. Could you stop throwing things around, please, Kat? Thank you. And had learned Norman French, was really into Norman culture, his best buddies were Normans. And so when he came back to England to reclaim his position as king, he had land to give away. He was going to reward his and keep his buddies with him. So he gave land to Normans who were close to him. He still wanted them around. And that's two of these sites here were identified as having been the heads, we call them the caputs, it's the Latin term, for these lands, some of these lands that he gave to his Norman allies. So, the reasoning being, well, look, there's already Normans in England prior to the Norman conquest. So surely if castles are that good, they'd have been building them. The other thing that they were basing it on were the written records. Now, I've already said to you that, they're not very keen on being super precise in the written records about what they call things castles. And that's true, but there is a very sudden switch in a source called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And they call things forts generally, and then they make a very sudden switch in 1052, where they start calling things castles, and they're particularly calling specific places castles. And so that's also these places on the picture here. So the combination of things here led the Royal Archaeological Institute to be like, okay, these two are a good bet to excavate. So under the year 1052, it was recorded that the Frenchmen, the Normans that is, had fled London, and some of them had gone west to Pentecost Castle, and some had headed north to Robert's Castle. So this motte is what they decided corresponded to Pentecost Castle, and that this one, Richard's Castle, which is in a pretty bad state, as you can see, was the other one, and that there was actually a third one, but that was destroyed in the 17th century, so I'm not going to investigating that. Now, of these three sites, only Richard's Castle was very heavily investigated, and they did not find any evidence for pre-conquest occupation, but you know, there are reasons for that in terms of the finds that would have been deposited. So those origins discussed, we are now going to talk about mottes. Mottes are one of the two types of earthwork slash earth and timber castles. But next week we're going to be looking at stone. We're kind of, you know, it's not so simple a chronology as it might seem. Now, part of the reason we think we know about mottes and associate them with the Normans in an English context is because they are shown on the Bayeux Tapestry. There's not that many of them constructed right during the period of conquest. Really, they are built sort of like the 10 years after, by the time we hit the 1070s. Instead, it looks like ringworks were preferred early on. We're going to see why later on. And mottes took more settled conditions. They weren't terrible, despite them being built here, they weren't terribly useful as campaign castles. Now, William did build castles, stone ones and motte ones, and they were overwhelmingly urban in location. He built 36 castles in all, and 24 of those were in urban locations, including the Tower of London, which we're going to talk about next week, hopefully, weather permitting. So when we were doing our brainstorming activity the other week about what is a castle, you know, we tend to associate them with the countryside, and yet a lot of the early ones are specifically urban constructed. And that's probably because he wanted to, you know, force his power, and the easiest way to do that was to pick the places that were wealthiest and had the biggest population. So the mottes, most of the mottes in Europe are built in the 11th and the 12th centuries. That's also true for ringworks as well. There's, of course, earlier examples in the 11th and 12th centuries, but the 11th and 12th centuries are really their heyday. Now, that's construction. Occupation could be a lot longer. There were, of course, later ones being built as well. Maybe they were used to evoke age. Oh, my family has been here a long time. What do you mean we're upstarts? Certainly excavations have shown that some of the mottes in Scotland were really late by English standards. So, you know, for example, the one known as the Peel of Lumphanan and Castle Hill in Strachan in Scotland, they were both constructed in the mid-13th century and occupied well into the 14th. And then the excavation of the motte at Roberton in Scotland, it was even later. It was constructed in the late 13th century or even the early 14th century. Why this might be to do with who was king at the time. The Scottish king was King David I, and he had been good friends with the Anglo-Normans and the Normans, and during his reign there was a big influx of Anglo-Norman landholders into Scotland. So it might be that he liked the culture and encouraged another building boom. Now, moths are pretty distinctive in shape. They are what we might call a Christmas pudding shape. Now, as I was reminded by the Tuesday class, you guys don't eat Christmas pudding at Christmas time. So only if you have a relative from the British Isles are you familiar with what a Christmas pudding looks like. And the Christmas pudding is a pretty distinctive shape in that it's sort of a cone shape with the top lopped off. It has a nice flat top on it. And you can see that at these two examples here. They're big mounds, but with a flat top. Had we been in class, I would have asked you about how you think they would have been constructed and how it wouldn't have just been a simple case of throwing earth together, because, you might try and build a stone tower in the middle of it. And for something to stand at this height for this many centuries, it needs to have been a bit more deliberate and structurally engineered than just flinging something together. No, I have to go back, sorry. This picture led a lot of castle scholars to suspect that, they must have done it in layers. So maybe a layer of rock or boulders, and then clay, and then soil, and then clay. And that's what they're showing in this picture. Particularly if they're throwing it up from digging a ditch. But of course, not all moths are surrounded by a ditch, kind of the point of a moth. So, however, it has been suggested that maybe what the Bayeux tapestry is showing, it's definitely showing construction, but maybe the stripy bits on the mound, maybe that's meant to show wood. Maybe that's meant to show timber planking, and not the different layers inside, because they've excavated moths. I was telling the Tuesday class there was somebody also called McAllister, who was an antiquarian scholar who used to like going around and blowing up the inside of barrows and mocks and stuff to see what the inside was made of. So not related to me. That's not my way of dealing with site identification, that's for sure. But anyway, as a result, they have excavated enough moths at this time to know that not all of them had this sort of layered construction pattern. But the flatness at the top would have been to be able to put stuff on top. Now, that might have been a timber tower, or might even have been a stone tower, of course. Just because we call them earth and timber castles doesn't mean there weren't masonry bits on them too. Contemporary descriptions describe keeps, houses, and these keeps or houses could have multiple rooms, they could have multiple functions, or maybe they're small enough, because some of them are very small, just have a watchtower. Like the bailey, the motte side and top would have been surrounded by palisades. And palisade, if you were in class, I would have asked you what a palisade was, but a palisade is like a wooden fence, but a bit more fence than that. They would have been wooden stake posts, probably pointy on top, so more defensive appearing than your regular fence. So it could have been residential or defensive on the top of a motte, but we need to remember that this wasn't just the only part of the castle complex. There could have been the bailey. Now, in saying that, doesn't necessarily mean that there was a bailey. Maybe there's buildings around it and they never bothered to construct a bailey, but then we're also up with the issue of preservation. Maybe the bailey has been destroyed. It's going to be pretty hard to destroy in a tractor if you're a farmer one of these mottes in the pictures. Much easier to fill in a ditch if it's in a place that doesn't suit you instead. So the bailey is the enclosure. Oh, before I move on to baileys, so just as an aside, we usually call them Christmas puddings because they're usually fairly circular or ovally in shape, although there are some sort of more square, rectangular shaped ones. There are particularly some of them in Scotland, actually. But anyway, so the bailey is the enclosure. This is Castle Acre in Norfolk, and I've gone for this one since they've got stone walls on the earthworks, so much easier for students to see, getting used to aerial imagery than alternatives. There might have been one bailey, there might have been multiple baileys, as this site shows. We can identify them when the banks and the ditches are left behind because they usually are kind of a lobe shape attached to the main motte. But you might find mottes alone without a bailey. Maybe the bailey was just formed by wooden palisades. Maybe there was no ditch or bank. Maybe some have said, oh, they were never finished or they were just observation posts. But, I studied later castles, particularly myself, and they don't all have surrounding enclosures, but they did all have surrounding buildings. So you don't necessarily have to have a bailey to still have buildings external to the main tower on top of the motte. So within the bailey would have been the buildings used in the running of the castle. It's rare to find multiple mottes. There are a few, but it's rare. Instead, most of it would have been in the bailey. And again, this would have been protected with these palisades. It could, in terms of building a motte, they were not very quick to build. It would at least take them a few months to build a motte. In some cases, it might even have taken years. In terms of their size, it varies hugely. Sometimes you see a motte and you're like, how did they get anything on top of that? And then sometimes you get huge areas where multiple buildings could have been. Now, if you look at this Castle Acre one, you can see that there's the foundations of a stone tower on top. So, they obviously would have got multiple buildings on top of Castle Acre. The other thing is that usually you go up the side of the motte and enter any buildings from that top level, but occasionally they were built, the entrances were built into the motte. So you went in at like a ground level, and then, you had a basement that was actually buried in the earth. But that's actually quite rare because it's quite difficult to construct that, or rather it takes quite deliberate planning to do so. Mottes could be up to 20 meters high. This Knockgraffan one is flipping high. You can see the people. There's actually somebody at the very bottom about to walk off. Thanks, Kat. I really wanted all my notes on the floor. It's exactly where I wanted them. Thank you. So some of them could be up to 20 meters high, but most were under 5 meters high. So, we're not talking about things that are absolutely ginormous. The bailey could vary in size as well. And of course, the size could vary over time. For example, you could have started off with a much smaller motte and then added things to it. And that's an area of castle studies that people are very interested in at the moment. That we're talking, Isabel, could you not? What have you done, you silly cat? Ah, jeepers. Right, sorry. Perils of teaching from home. Rogue animals. Where was I? Yeah, so we're going to be adding, to castles. It's not like a one and done. Oh, I've built my castle, I'm going to rest on my laurels. You constantly would have been tinkering with it, particularly if you're talking about centuries of occupation. So we're talking about multiple periods and phases of use. So it might have been that you added a stone tower at a later date. Or you added extra space, or you made it bigger, or you added more fortifications. And so this could have all happened within the individual site history. Buildings inside tended to be rectangular. The most important one, and if we're going to be able to identify one in the bailey, it tends to be the hall, because the hall was like the ultimate multi-purpose space in the Middle Ages. Feasting was a key part of lordly identity, lordly behaviour. Courts would have been held there. I mean, plus, anybody you didn't want in your most private space, have them in, or numbers wise, have them in the hall. Privacy actually is a developing concept in the Middle Ages into something we would call privacy today. That's something we're going to be talking about in a later class. So also within any enclosure would have been sleeping areas, service areas, stables. But again, finding these buildings can be really difficult because preservation is again an issue, particularly if if they're built up urban areas, they'll have been built on by houses. And if they were in the countryside and they're good farmland, as most of these tend to be on good farmland, they're not in rubbish places where they can't financially support themselves, then a farmer will have been over it to plough and churn it up. Or even if it's not for ploughing, sheep and cows can do a fair amount of damage traipsing over the ground. So again, just to remind you that just because these were built at the same time as stone castles, It doesn't mean that you were any less wealthy or powerful because you built an earth and timber castle rather than a stone one. The other thing is, we are looking at not the bits that medieval people would have liked. And I think it's easiest looking at Castle Acre here and seeing that we can see the stone foundations when we look at it from above, from an aerial perspective. But obviously these are foundations. So even though we're like, oh, we can see this one really clearly, we're talking about foundations still. Okay, so on to ringworks. The ringwork castle is much harder to identify. The emphasis is not on height. I've actually picked two bad examples here, but I already showed them to the Tuesday class, so you're going to look at them too. The emphasis is not on internal height. Sometimes they might have had a bit of a raised platform, but the platform with the main building did not have to be raised at all. The emphasis was instead on the banks and ditches. Again, ringworks begin to appear across northwestern Europe in the 10th and 11th centuries. And of the two types of earth and timber castles, we think it would have been ringworks that would have been known earlier in England and actually in Ireland as well. So on a European-wide scale, it seems to be ringworks were evolving as the earliest type of castle. Now, they were also a lot quicker to raise than mottes, because you did not have to worry about constructing the height. Instead, it was banks and ditches, and you could construct the banks by digging out the ditches. So it was comparatively much, much faster to dig. We're talking sometimes a matter of days to build them, although the ones I'm showing you here would not have been constructed in days. They would have taken a long time too. But because of this comparative speed, it's been argued that they were the most common castle type after any conquest or military activity, and that mottes were therefore built when they were more settled and they had more time. And the pattern might be that ringworks were more numerous in areas than mottes than when first conquered. But a further complication is that you might actually build a ringwork and then add a motte to it, because if you look at these pictures on the right here, these are slightly raised platforms, but it wouldn't have been much to keep on building up and adding more earth onto these and turning them into a motte at a later stage if you wanted to. Indeed, the first castle constructed by the Normans on landing in England was a ringwork at Pevensey, and they did this by cutting off a bit of an earlier fortifications. So a lot of them seem to have been developed from earlier defences, which also makes them difficult to identify. Popular things to adapt them from included Iron Age hill forts and Roman forts and burhs. That's what we call the Anglo-Saxon fortified towns, the Anglo-Saxon burhs. A neat one is Silchester in Hampshire in England, which was actually a Roman amphitheatre. They converted the Roman amphitheatre into a ringwork. So they've been long abandoned by this point. But, you know, think about the symbolism involved in converting a Roman amphitheatre into your castle if you're a new arrival in England. Now, we need to get over that's being like a lesser version of the motte. It's an alternative to the motte. These still would have been very visible in the landscape, and they would have held a lot of significance for the local population. The reasons for using a pre-existing fortification, there might be some symbolism there, but it's also practical. You know, these are building a castle, even an earth and timber one, was a huge undertaking in the Middle Ages, so why not save yourself some time and some resources? And ringwork castles continued to be constructed alongside motte castles through these 11th and 12th centuries. Now, an interesting thing is their distribution. They seem to have been significantly fewer in number in England and Wales than motte castles. In terms of their numbers, it seems to be the mottes outnumber ringworks about 4 to 1 in England and as high as 12 to 1 in Ireland. This picture here on the left shows that it's actually about 3 to 1 in Wales. So Wales has got the best density of ringwork castles. Part of the reason why there's many more mottes than ringworks, well, might be any of the reasons I just gave you, but also ringworks can be hard to identify. We get them confused with other earlier structures. Human beings have loved building circles. fortifications and circles with banks and ditches. So there's a lot of things we can get them confused by, and it's only through a systematic process of field work that we end up with a much more accurate number. Although I have a colleague who did her PhD on ringworks in Ireland and did a quarter of Ireland for her PhD. It took her many years, and she actually did find that the 12-to-1 ratio was correct for Ireland. There were a lot of misidentifications, but it still meant that overall the ratio was pretty spot on. So in total, there's like maybe 1,000 of these surviving, which is pretty low in terms of castle numbers. They often occur in these localized clusters. Like, that's why I picked the distribution map of Wales. So sometimes it's like, that's interesting. We're trying to make sense of the distribution pattern. Now, if we were in class, I'd ask you for some ideas. The Tuesday class, a good ideas to give me. So I'm sure you guys would have had good thoughts as to why we end up with clustering of ringworks. One of the things might have been geology. It's going to be, a lot easier to build a ringwork or a motte depending on local geology, whether it's rocky or very sandy. So the soil type is really going to make a big impact. There's also going to be, the individual preference, but also local trends, local fashions. So if your most powerful local guy who you really looked up to and aspired to build a ringwork or a motte, you might just copy him because that's what he did. So good enough for him, it's good enough for you. Another thing is the topography. For example, we often find a lot of ringworks on ridges. And you think about it, what is the point of raising more height if you're already at the highest point within your territory? Why bother fixing something that isn't broken? So if the site already has commanding views, the height of a motte might not necessarily add anything and just instead cost you extra money. So again, ringworks, 11th, 12th century, but inhabitation continuing much, much longer. If we did not have COVID, we would be reading a poem, a Welsh poem about a castle called Sycharth, and it's all, it's so beautiful. It has so much shiny, shiny timber. And we would be reading that and talking about how that poem was written in the early 15th century. And he's describing a ringwork castle, and he's obviously well impressed. And while he's totally biased, he's totally sucking up to the lord of the castle, he still is genuinely impressed with this castle. So we can't think of ringworks also as being inferior to other types of castle when we read that poem. Sorry, I got that wrong. The poem was written by Iolo Goch in the late 14th century. It was destroyed in the early 15th century. Well, 20 years out there. Now, in saying you might have them on hills. That's what that poem talks about. In fact, that top right there is a reconstruction of Sycharth. But you might also find them on low ground next to rivers. Where you might find mottes or stone castles. So we can't just simply boil it down to things like geology and topography. Now, if we're going to define them, this is a good definition here to work from. A ringwork castle is an earth and timber castle of high medieval date, usually consisting of a circular or subcircular platform enclosed by at least one bank and ditch. And if I was to suggest that, as you furiously right now, you underline any part of it, I would underline bank and ditch, and at least one. We find ones with multiple banks and ditches. So what a ringwork is an enclosure defended by a bank of ditch. And again, what we're looking at is the foundations. There would have been a lot more timber here originally, lots of palisades. We tend not to find ringworks in Bailey, so certainly they do exist. But if you look at the side, this one here is a, I want to say Rathangan. No, Rathangan with a motte. So this one is, oh gosh, it's up by Rathangan. I'm throwing a blank. I know exactly where it is. It's, there's no point in me telling you exactly where it is. I'm going to get too into the weeds there. Anyway, it's in Ireland. And it is a good example of how big they could be. This is a particularly big one, because we think it probably would have been converted from an earlier site. But if you look at the size of this, you would have been able to fit a lot of buildings in the interior here. Not just, you know, a tower, like potentially at a very small mott. So you might not have had as much need for a bailey if you had a good whopping ringwork. So that actually could explain why they might be better, that you could get more buildings into the defensive or particularly impressive part of it. Usually rounded in shape. There are D-shaped examples though, particularly if they're adapting from an earlier structure or taking use of natural features like escarpments. Most of them are between 35 and 50 meters in diameter. Of the ones outside the range, there's a couple that are smaller, and they tend to be more raised. So it's kind of like, ooh, it's kind of, if a mott in a ringwork had a baby for those smaller ones. And there's also a couple of bigger ones that, you know, they were reusing earlier features, like amphitheaters. So sometimes the enclosure was the same level as the surrounding land. Sometimes it would have been like a raised platform, but not as raised as a mott. And generally they had more of a concave profile. And if we were in class, you would now see my lovely profile drawings on the whiteboard, which Tuesday's class got subjected to, and I would show what this concave profile looks like. Basically, you end up with like a little tiny bank forming around the lip of the ringwork where the palisades probably were, and the rest of it would have been sort of eroded over the centuries because you would have had buildings there, people tramping around. So this slightly concave profile is pretty common. If that makes no sense to you, just tell me when you see me next Thursday. Oh, God, we see each other next Thursday, and I will draw you a beautiful profile picture on the whiteboard for you to see what I mean by a concave profile. No problem. Now, these terms are generalizations, and there's been pushback about the term ringwork. Some people have been like, just call them enclosures, but you know, enclosures, so yeah, that's pretty medieval in terms of how useless it is in a modern parlance. As I said, they could be raised in a few days, but the big ones, obviously something this size that we're looking at here on the slide, would have taken much, much longer. They would have likely have had a gate tower to control access, because the most vulnerable part was the entranceway, and we'll see how that's something that's in common with castles. It's not even just from a defensive perspective, though, as we're going to see. It's not a simple, I mean, it's easy in the case of timber castles to be like, oh, well, this only has a bank and a ditch. They must have had to have a very defensive entrance. But as we're going to be talking soon, I mean, entranceways are the bit that everybody interacts with, the bit that most people see. So you're going to put all your architectural effort into the thing that most people are going to see. You know, you're not going to spend a fortune on features built by a specialist architect and masonry builder if nobody's going to see them. The principal structure in the interior of the ringwork was usually a tower and then the hall as well. So in other words, very similar to what was happening in motte summits. Preservation is again a real issue with ringworks because they are lower, flatter banks and ditches. Ploughing, tree roots, like in the picture here, being a problem, animals tramping over as well, and there's no really good consensus as to, like, you know, do you rope them off from animals and stop them from being able to tramp over them, or do you let it grow wild, or let them, yeah, we can't decide what the best way to preserve them is. Now, in terms of function, continue. Yeah. How do I get this back? Current slide. There we go. Right. In terms of the function, they seem to have been the castle type of choice in the initial conquest period in England, but, I'm going to say it again, constructed and occupied, particularly emphasizing occupied alongside motts and stone castles along the late 11th, the 12th and the 13th centuries. These bad boys had the same roles as associated with other medieval castles. Now, the neat thing about them, though, is they might have been used as campaign castles or siege castles because little ones could be thrown up pretty quickly. The archaeological and documentary evidence indicates that a large number of ringwork castles in England were constructed during a period of civil war called the Anarchy. And the Anarchy lasted from about 1140 to 1150 in England, and it was over who was going to be ruler of England, Matilda or Stephen. Matilda's obviously on the left here, that's Stephen on the right. Long story short, Matilda's father had been king, he was Henry I. She was the child surviving, he didn't like her and wanted his nephew Stephen to be king instead, and civil war broke out over who should be ruling. Ultimately the compromise was that Matilda's son would become king after Stephen died, and he became Henry II. So they seem to have really boomed, ringworks that is, during the Anarchy, because they could be really useful as siege works. These small ones could be constructed quite quickly, but at the same time you could fit a lot of garrisons in there. So as King and Alcock have pointed out, almost all siege works or suspected siege works are ringworks, end quote. So the Wren studied 31 known siege works, and he found that they tended to be constructed at about 200 to 300 yards, that is about 200 meters away from a castle that they were besieging, so that they could overlook, try and starve them out, but be out of bowshot, so that they couldn't, the people being besieged couldn't, fire arrows at them and make them go away. So it's surprising, since they were built so hastily, that we can actually still identify some in the landscape. And here's an example of one. This is from Exeter in England. On the top left there is the remains of a very small ringwork, as you can see by comparing it to the interpretive board. This is called Danes Castle. It was 275 meters away from Exeter Castle, of which part of it is shown in that picture on the right. That's also part of the town walls, which were used as Roman buildings. Very hard to find decent pictures of the moat part of Exeter Castle. So very small inside, but that's a much bigger bank than the interior. And we have the historical sources saying that it was built by Matilda's allies, and then they besieged Stephen's forces inside Exeter castles. So they could be used as siege castles, ringworks, but they could also be counter castles, which could be up to 15 miles away from an enemy castle. So they weren't there to facilitate siege, but rather to help with raids or protect from raids or prevent foraging for supplies. Another thing that ringworks were particularly well suited to was what we call adulterine castles, and that's not castles cheating on other castles. As we will discuss in later classes, if you were building a castle, you were supposed to get permission from the monarch, called a license to crenellate. But if there was civil war, like during the Anarchy, you might not want to go to Stephen because you might be a supporter of Matilda's, and anyway, you might take advantage of the civil war to do what you want to do. And I'm going to pause here because there's a train about to go past and blast its horn. It's calling me a liar. It's going to blast its horn now, and then I'm going to resume talking. Okay, so adulterine means that they were built without monarchical authority, and they could do this during the Anarchy because the monarchs were busy doing other things. So it was particularly rebellious barons who wanted to kind of assert themselves who did this. But as I said, the ultimate compromise comes when Matilda's son Henry becomes king after Stephen, and Henry, one of the first things he did was identify these adulterine castles and flatten them, raise them to the ground, because they didn't have the license, they didn't have the authority. And then that was also a very symbolic thing, because if you think about it, he's really saying, oh, you might have got away with this during the Civil War, called the Anarchy, but this is not going to happen during my reign. No chance at all. I am a different kettle of fish. So licenses to crenulate and what they tell us and their uses of them is an issue we're gonna keep referring to. Of course, the anarchy we think explains a lot of the distributions of ringworks in England, and the weird clustering as well. So we also need to keep in mind the historical perspective when looking at castles. All right, that is all that I wanted to cover and would have covered in class. So hopefully I see you next Thursday. And next Thursday we are going to do masonry castles. I'm going to kind of go back in time. And overlap with these earth and timber castles. As I said at the start of this video, definitely go through your textbook and look for case studies to illustrate the points that I was just telling you. That is my recommendation to prepare for the exam, even though it's many weeks in the future yet. You know it will not be long coming in by this point. And yeah, I will see you next Thursday, hopefully.